Well, we are cursed to live in interesting times, aren't we? We've managed, and I hope that our democratic institutions have managed to survive 4 years of what will certainly be remembered as the worst presidency in American history. An American president who, for all appearances, seemed to be working to end American history with unprecedented favors for Russia and other enemies of democracy. What is possibly even more horrifying is that this phenomenally incompetent and dangerous president probably would have been reelected had it not been for the pandemic that he has managed so poorly right in the middle of an election year. He came too close to winning as it was. And while there were many factors, including both some hard work in mobilizing the black vote in Georgia, thank you, Stacey Abrams, and the choice of a woman of color as a running mate, but as my friend Steve Belts pointed out to me in a recent phone call, without Trump's disastrous leadership in the pandemic, he probably would have won a second term. And Steve, let me just tell you, if you're listening, if you've got any more great insights, please keep them to yourself. I'm trying to reduce stress. COVID-19 has now taken more than 300,000 lives in America, 15,000 in the last week. And a few months ago, some experts were saying that we might be still 2 years away before we could develop a working vaccine, which meant that we might be facing a death toll of somewhere between 2 and 3 million people before the virus went away. We really must pause to both wonder and express gratitude for the fact that scientists have in recent months accomplished a truly unprecedented miracle. The previous record for developing a vaccine was 4 years, and the one before that was 8 years. The coronavirus has been around in several forms for more than a generation, but no human vaccine for any iteration of a coronavirus had ever been developed for humans. We had one for dogs, oddly enough, but we never got a vaccine for any of them. But last week, with no government money involved, scientists at Pfizer got emergency authorization to start distributing their vaccine. And on Friday of this week, a second vaccine from Moderna, one that does not require the super cold storage and transportation that will allow us to reach out and begin vaccinating people in rural parts of America. And of course, it holds promise for a lot of third world countries where refrigeration is not nearly as available. But I want to take a moment to introduce you to one of the lead scientists at Moderna who has brought this vaccine into the world. This is 34-year-old, diminutive, beautiful scientist, Kesmika Corbett. She's not only been a leader in the research and development, but she has also not been quiet. She's been stepping out to speak to the unequal distribution of healthcare in this pandemic that has led to a disproportionate number of deaths in the black community. And I think it's important to highlight Kesmika and other black scientists involved in our vaccine projects to help the black community to overcome the distrust and entirely reasonable fear that black people have of a government-sponsored vaccine program. But you know, even more, I want us to talk about her because white people still find the appearance of someone like Kesmika in the middle of a science research project to at least unconsciously be something of a surprise. It's not just the Proud Boys, it's not just QAnon or the far-right KKK types, but liberal allies of civil rights who still, we have to admit, we sometimes feel like we are the heroes in rescuing blacks from the unjust circumstances of life, as if our black brothers and sisters were sort of a liberal white man's burden. Even white progressives, who too often think of themselves as saviors, suffer from unconscious racism that continues to perpetuate myths of racial inferiority, so that some real education needs to take place among my tribe. What we need is not just a lot of woke white people who can claim that we're not racist. We need white people who become well enough informed to become seriously anti-racist. And the two are not the same. We've tried Black History Month. We got a Martin Luther King Jr. national holiday. We even have postage stamps with heroes of the civil rights movement. But there are stubborn stereotypes that resist any subtle correction. White people are going to have to do serious reading and study to uncover the roots of our own racism. Kismika grew up poor, but she had a shot at a couple of good scholarships that got her out of her humble beginnings, which for me is just more evidence for why we need to have tuition-free colleges. Because without her PhD in science, we might have lost another 1 million people waiting for a second vaccine. This is not just a scholarship to help her. It's a scholarship to help us. This is no exaggeration. When Anthony Fauci was asked about black involvement in the development of the vaccines, he, without hesitation, started talking about Kismika. But the media, I have to say, hasn't said much, because even liberal 24-hour news services have a sensitivity to their audience, and her very black face doesn't fit our narrative of science. Now, 4 years ago, when the biographical movie Hidden Figures was released, which told the story of 3 black female mathematicians who worked at NASA before computers were very sophisticated, and they literally made it possible for us to put astronauts in space in 1963. But folks, that movie was the first hint I had ever had of that story. Loved the movie, but I was disturbed by the fact that I needed a Hollywood movie to tell me about the existence of these 3 seminal thinkers who were the geniuses that made space travel possible during racial apartheid in America. I was born in 1956. I remember the Mercury space flights. I grew up with the news and reports in Life magazine. I took the pictures out of Life of the moonshot and put them up on the wall of my bedroom. I knew who John Glenn was. No one ever told me about these black women who made it happen. Again, it's because they didn't fit the narrative. The narrative edits itself. These stories have been so suppressed that it isn't just white people who didn't know about them. Black people have been starved for exposure to their own stories. I remember hearing Chris Rock talking about taking a course in black history, thinking it would be an easy A. I'm black, after all. But he discovered that other than a few stories about Martin Luther King Jr. and a mention of George Washington Carver, that black children's education in their own culture, scientific contributions, and leaders in their community has been almost as bad as the education of whites. We've seen black people in entertainment. We've seen black people in sports. It's true enough that certain groups of people excel in certain areas, and black performers and athletes have earned a place in our awareness, but you have to admit, for years they were held back. Elvis Presley was chosen as a white singer who sounded black. There was a black league of baseball players that they didn't want competing with whites. Even in the boxing arena, it took a long time to let us show black people performing and outperforming white people in public venues. But black scientists, researchers, writers and teachers, they don't have to do what they do in public, and we rarely hear about them. So we're still being trained, almost like the days of slavery, where we thought of blacks as being strong farm animals almost. We're being trained to think of black people as singers and dancers and musicians and athletes. It's just not fair. For years, I've encouraged white people to read novels by the late Toni Morrison, who I believe captured black culture and experience better than anyone I had known before. I don't know that I'm the right person to judge that, but I loved her books and felt like I got real insight from it. The Nobel Prize winner was also one of my listeners, a fact which has nothing to do with anything that I'm talking about today. But if Toni Morrison had been one of your listeners, you'd probably try to work it into conversation too. I've been trying to figure out how to get it onto my resume for decades now. Her death last year was a real blow, and a lot of folks I heard talking about it thought that Ta-Nehisi Coates was going to take up her mantle. But I've got a new crush. I am slowly and painfully reading Isabel Wilkerson's new book that talks about race in America as a caste, like the caste system that we know of in the history of India. I say that I'm slowly and painfully reading it because she's telling me so many things that I didn't know, that I admit that I didn't even want to know all of them. But I have to slow down and just emotionally process what she's telling me. Did you all know that the architects of the Nazi Holocaust in their early days in power met and studied the books about racial apartheid in the USA? Did you know that they quoted heavily Harvard scientists in genetics and other prominent university professors who wrote about the racial inferiority of blacks and helped to put into place the early 20th century laws that kept white people from marrying people of color? Did you know that there were aspects of America's legal Jim Crow and racist laws that the Nazis thought went too far? But Hitler wrote personal notes to some of America's scientists telling them how much he appreciated their work and how they had inspired him. Now, people where I'm from in rural Kentucky often curled their lips at the civil rights movement and would say things like, "Well, I never owned a slave. What does this have to do with me?" And I wasn't smart enough to say it then, but I wish I could go back in time and say, but did you ever drink from a whites-only drinking fountain? Did you ever sit in a whites-only waiting room in a train station? Did you ever go to a segregated school or a de facto segregated church? Or did you ever live in a neighborhood where blacks were legally prevented from buying a house? Sure, slavery officially ended 180 years ago, but as Wilkerson carefully narrates, that did not end the caste system in America. The end of the war gave birth to Jim Crow laws, and almost immediately the KKK and lynchings, where there were big trees in small towns that might have even been in the middle of a road, but they adjusted the streets to keep that tree in the middle of town because that's where they held public lynchings. Racism was so deeply entrenched that it has defied school and workplace integration. Even now, we see repeal of the voters' rights legislation giving southern states permission to make it increasingly difficult for black and brown people to vote. Trump shamelessly demanded that votes from largely black communities in Detroit and Atlanta simply be gathered up and discarded, not because they weren't legitimate votes, but because they were cast by black people. And our racist president does not believe that a black man or woman literally has a legal right to vote against him. For most of my adult life, the racial caste system in America has been enforced in subtle ways. But Trump he's got a habit of saying the quiet parts out loud. From his S-hole countries comments to a suggestion that even American-born women of color in Congress should be sent back to where they're from. He's not a subtle racist, and that's, I'm afraid, what so many people have liked about him. Without the ravages of the pandemic, we would have had this racist in the White House for another 4 years. The very concept of race is basically an American invention. There were no white people in Europe. You think about it. There were Germans, there were French, there were English, there were Italians, there were Irish, but they didn't call themselves white until they came to America. The Irish suffered a lot of anti-Catholic discrimination when they first came here, but they assimilated because they were white. Wilkerson recounts a conversation she had with a Nigerian-born playwright who told her, you know, there are no black people in Africa, which sounds like nonsense, right? The sub-Saharan continent is nothing but black people. But the woman explained, there are Igbo, there are Yoruba, there's Iwi, there's Akan, there's Ndebele. They're not black. They're just people. There were no white people in Europe. There were no black people in Africa until they came here. This is our caste system. It is an invention to protect the white privilege that maintains the differences in wealth, income, status, employment, and education that white people enjoy for no morally defensible reason, and yet mostly we enjoy it without ever being conscious of it because we have resisted the necessary education. A century ago, when it was still illegal for white people to marry blacks or Asians, the definition of who was white and who wasn't was legally described in state segregation laws. Most states insisted that 1 drop of Negro blood made a person black. But when you get down to 1/16, 1/32, it takes more than just looking. The laws then would question association. If someone who looked white associated with black people, then they were assigned to the lower caste. It was interesting to me several years ago when we were first introduced to Barack Obama that he was instantly identified as being black. He had a black father whom he hardly knew, but he had a white mother who was an anthropologist from Kansas. Thankfully, he got to move from Kansas to Hawaii. I wonder how many people in Kansas would like to do that. But he grew up with his white grandparents, which at least in Hawaii placed him in a more racially diverse setting. But why is Barack Obama black and not white, or not both? To some degree, I assume he had social pressure from those around him because he looks black. But at some point, Obama had to choose to identify as black. Similarly, now Kamala Harris has a black father and an Asian mother, and people from both ethnic groups are loudly claiming her. But at some point, Kamala chose to go to a traditionally black college and to identify herself as black. And if I'm reading the tea leaves right, she could just as easily have identified as Asian. Last January, I was sitting at the dinner table with my old seminary friends in their home in Birmingham, and they've not always cheered my left-leaning politics, but as a black family, we found that we really agreed that we did not like Donald Trump, and we talked about which black woman we would like to see at the top of the Democratic ticket. We like Stacey Abrams, but when Kamala's name came up and it was mentioned that she is married to a white Jewish man, you could see some doubt creeping in. Only in America would a white man and 2 black friends seriously engage in a conversation about someone asking, well, how black is she really? There are 2 people in my family, me and my Korean-born daughter, But I'll bet you no one has ever sat around a dining room table speculating about how white I am. I find it slightly entertaining when people buy genetic tests and announce what percentage of their heritage is from Norway or Russia or Ireland. People 100,000 years ago, our ancestors started to migrate out of Africa. Where are you from? You are from Africa. Do you walk upright and have an opposable thumb? You are from Africa. Some of you left more recently than others, but so far as genetics is concerned, race doesn't even exist. It's much ado about melatonin. There is almost no genetic difference between Asians and whites and Native Americans and Indians from the subcontinent or blacks. Scientifically, genetically, anthropologically, race doesn't exist. However, socially, it does exist. And it exists as a form of toxic sickness that America is only starting to wake up from. Race is not real. Racism is very real. Looked at over a 50-year span of time, unemployment figures go up and down, but consistently, black unemployment remains twice what white unemployment is. A black man is 5 times more likely to be incarcerated for the same crime as a white man. A black man is 8 times more likely to be shot by the police when being arrested as a white man. The numbers in this chart are a bit dated, but the contrast is still about the same. White and Asian families tend to have 10 to 12 times the accumulated wealth of Hispanic and black families. And as a side note, without tuition-free college, this gap is only going to get worse. Now, you might say that Kesmika Corbett was one of the lucky ones because she got scholarships that allowed her to pursue her education in science, but we all need to slow down a second right at that point. Because I think I'm the lucky one. When the paltry 50 million doses of Pfizer vaccine that Trump ordered have all been used up to inoculate healthcare workers and nursing home residents, a theological fat senior citizen fighting type 2 diabetes will have to be standing in line for the Moderna vaccine. So I'm luckier than Kesmika. I'm lucky that Kesmika got to go to college for a long time, become a scientist, and at the ripe old age of 34, she gets to create the vaccine that will very likely save my life and the life of a whole lot of other corpulent white guys who are just like me. White people are so afraid of losing privilege, status, preferential treatment, they typically have no idea how racism hurts them too. It confines them in a prison of fear and immorality, that it deprives our culture of great scientists, inventors, statesmen, writers, as well as musicians, actors, and athletes. There is no end to the caste system until we raise the employment rate, the wages, and the capital wealth in minority families. We have to do that, or racism will never be unrooted. We can either tax the rich or we can eat the rich, but it's going to be one or the other. In sum, we need to realize, even before we get started, that we are already lucky that most black people are asking for justice rather than revenge, even though revenge may be what they deserve. Justice is about 400 years late in coming for our black brothers and sisters. And I just believe that any further delay is unacceptable.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.